Germany, February 1945. Snow drifts across the ruins of a once proud town near Cologne. The church steeple leans broken over streets filled with rubble and silence. Women wander between collapsed buildings searching for wood, bread, anything that might keep their families alive another night. Through the gray stillness comes the sound of boots. A column of captured American airmen trudges down the road flanked by weary German guards. Their faces are hollow but calm. Each carries a small parcel stamped with a red cross, a symbol that now means life. From a doorway, a German woman watches. Her husband is dead, her son missing, her kitchen empty. Yet these prisoners, these enemies, receive food she cannot find, medicine she cannot touch, kindness she no longer expects from her own country. For the first time, she feels something stranger than fear, disbelief. How could the enemy be living better than those they fought to destroy? By early 1945, the Third Reich was unraveling. Allied bombers had reduced entire cities to smoking skeletons. Trains no longer ran reliably. Food convoys were ambushed or destroyed. Civilians stood in endless lines for bread that never came. In towns across Western Germany, women became the backbone of survival. With husbands gone to the front or already dead, they scavenged for coal, bartered for food, and watched their children grow thin and silent. Yet while the population starved, enemy prisoners were often treated in a way that shocked the very people living under the collapsing Nazi regime. When captured American or British airmen arrived at prison camps, their fate didn't always follow the brutal image many imagined. This wasn't out of mercy but calculation. The German High Command understood that mistreating Western prisoners could bring retaliation against their own captured soldiers. Thanks to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war from the West often received parcels from organizations like International Committee of the Red Cross. Inside those parcels were tinned meat, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, soap, and sometimes medical supplies, items German civilians hadn't seen in years. German women noticed. They noticed everything. They saw Allied POWs wearing clean clothes while their own children wore patched rags. They saw cigarettes passed casually between captured pilots while their neighbors coughed in unheated rooms. They watched guards respect rules and hand over Red Cross packages even as their own pantries stood empty. It was a bitter contrast that dug deep. In some towns, resentment brewed quietly. In others, it boiled over into whispered conversations that carried real risk. Criticizing the regime openly was dangerous. But behind closed doors, many women asked the same question: why are our enemies eating while we starve? This situation didn't just reflect Germany's collapse. It exposed a deep divide between propaganda and reality. For years, civilians were told they were fighting a righteous, invincible war. But in those final months, the sight of healthy POWs and starving citizens told a different story. One no speech from Adolf Hitler could hide. And in a war where millions had already been stripped of humanity, the image of enemy soldiers living better than the people of the Reich was more than unsettling. It was a sign that the war was already lost. As 1945 dragged into its brutal end, the contrast between German civilians and Allied POWs reached its sharpest point. Across camps in places like Moosburg, Hammelburg, and Stalag Luft III, thousands of captured American and British soldiers lived under guarded but regulated conditions. They slept in wooden barracks, counted rations, and waited for liberation. Their days were marked by boredom and uncertainty, but not by starvation. In nearby towns, German women faced a different reality. Food stamps became worthless paper. Coal for heating was gone. Bombing raids left families buried in cellars and streets filled with rubble. Mothers boiled weeds for soup, while their children scoured fields for anything edible. The war propaganda had promised sacrifice for victory, but now it was sacrifice for survival. Some women worked in or near the POW camps, cleaning, cooking, or laundering uniforms. What they saw shocked them. Prisoners who should have been broken looked almost comfortable compared to their own people. American airmen received parcels from the Red Cross filled with tinned food, butter, and cigarettes. A single cigarette could buy a family's meal in the black market. At times, small exchanges occurred quietly, hidden from guards. A German woman might trade a piece of bread for a cigarette or a spoonful of powdered milk. These secret trades were acts of desperation, not defiance. The women didn't see enemies. They saw men who had food when their children did not. Inside the camps, the POWs understood the irony. Some wrote in diaries about seeing German civilians begging outside the fences. They didn't gloat. Most were stunned. "They looked worse than we did," one American sergeant later recalled. "It was hard to believe the enemy we'd been bombing was starving while we were being fed by them." In some regions, especially as Allied forces pushed into Germany, the guards themselves grew weaker and hungrier. The chain of command began to break. Civilians sought help from the very prisoners they were supposed to hate. There were moments when POWs shared food through the wire. The sight of that, enemy soldiers feeding German women and children, was something no propaganda film could erase. The situation laid bare the failure of Nazi ideology. It claimed racial superiority and loyalty to the Führer, yet those at the bottom, women, children, and the old, were left to fend for themselves, while captured enemies received regulated care. The Geneva Convention became, in a grim twist, more powerful than Nazi promises. By April 1945, as Allied tanks rolled across Bavaria and Saxony, the entire system began to dissolve. Many guards fled. Prison gates were left open. Civilians rushed toward the camps not to attack, but to beg for food. U.S. and British soldiers inside watched in disbelief as starving women and children reached through the fences crying for bread. It was one of the war's most bitter ironies. The same barbed wire meant to cage the enemy now protected the only people in Germany still eating regularly. When the Allies finally liberated those camps, they found prisoners in surprisingly stable condition. Thin, yes, but alive and alert. Outside the fences, the civilian population looked worse. The liberators' first challenge wasn't just securing POWs, it was dealing with the desperate German townspeople swarming the gates. Many of those women would later write about the humiliation of that moment. They had believed in a powerful Reich, but when it fell, they saw that even their enemies had been treated with more humanity than they had received from their own leaders. For historians, this chapter of the war reveals a subtle but devastating truth. Ideology can command loyalty, but hunger reveals reality. Germany's surrender in May 1945 didn't feel like victory for anyone within its borders. Cities were silent ruins filled with people too weak to cheer or resist. The Allies had come as conquerors, but many arrived to find a nation already defeated by hunger and exhaustion. In the weeks that followed, the contrast between captured Allied POWs and the German civilians outside their former camps became even clearer. The prisoners now freed were processed, fed, and sent home. Trucks arrived with medical teams and supply crates. Within days, the men who had spent years behind wire fences were wearing clean uniforms, eating full meals and preparing to board trains bound for France or Italy. Just beyond those same fences, German civilians searched for food in bombed-out kitchens. The lucky ones found Allied relief centers, but most had to barter and beg. Women traded jewelry for bread, family heirlooms for powdered milk. The Reich's promise of eternal victory had left them with nothing but rubble. Many German women who had worked near POW camps carried deep shame. They had seen with their own eyes how decency had survived on the enemy's side. American and British prisoners had been treated under Geneva rules, while loyal German citizens had been abandoned by the regime that demanded their devotion. Some women even testified during post-war investigations, describing how they'd envied the very men they once feared. One woman from Regensburg later wrote, "We had believed we were the chosen people, but it was the prisoners who were treated like human beings." Her words captured the moral collapse of a nation that had confused power with worth. As Allied occupation began, the same soldiers who had once been prisoners now walked through German towns, distributing food to civilians. It was a surreal reversal. Enemies turned caretakers. The same rations that had sustained POWs now fed their former captors. The shock went both ways. American soldiers, many still angry over bombings and lost comrades, were unprepared for what they found. Thin, hollow-eyed women pushing wheelbarrows, children in oversized coats scavenging through trash. Some couldn't bring themselves to hate anymore. After seeing them like that, one U.S. private said, "It didn't feel like victory. It felt like pity." The collapse of Nazi Germany had created a society without hierarchy. Soldiers, mothers, old men, All stood in the same food lines. In that leveling came an uncomfortable clarity. The lies that had sustained the Reich had finally starved to death. For historians, this moment revealed the strange resilience of international law. The Geneva Convention, often dismissed as idealistic, had proven more durable than Nazi ideology itself. The prisoners who survived because of it became living proof that even in total war, rules mattered. German civilians, especially women, learned that lesson painfully. They had carried the burden of loyalty to a system that offered no loyalty in return. Many would spend years trying to reconcile that betrayal. Churches, schools, and new local governments tried to rebuild moral ground from the ashes. The process was slow, uneven, and haunted by memory. In 1946 and 1947, as Germany struggled under Allied occupation, some former POWs returned, not as soldiers but as peacekeepers and aid workers. They recognized faces from behind barbed wire. A few met the same women who had once traded with them secretly during the war. Those brief encounters carried quiet dignity. There were no apologies, just nods of recognition that humanity had survived where politics had failed. Meanwhile, records from the Red Cross and Allied archives confirmed what many Germans already suspected. Their prisoners had been better off than they were. The figures were hard to ignore. Mortality rates among American and British POWs in German camps were significantly lower than civilian death rates from bombing, starvation, and exposure. This reality became part of Germany's post-war reckoning. The propaganda of racial superiority crumbled under the evidence of moral inferiority. Feeding prisoners while civilians starved wasn't an act of kindness. It was a bureaucratic necessity that exposed the hollowness of Nazi promises. For the women who had endured it, that hypocrisy lingered longest. They had carried children through bombings, waited for husbands who never returned, and watched strangers, enemy soldiers, receive care and food that their own families were denied. It was a cruel revelation, but also a cleansing one. In a nation built on deception, the truth finally held weight. History often measures victory by territory gained or enemies defeated. But in the quiet aftermath of World War II, the true measure lay in something simpler: how human beings treated one another when the rules of war collapsed. For many German women, seeing captured American POWs treated with care and dignity was more than a cultural shock. It was a moral awakening. It shattered years of propaganda that had painted the Allies as monsters. Instead, they saw that discipline, compassion, and restraint had survived even in the heat of war. That realization changed how post-war generations understood both defeat and decency. It reminded them that moral strength can outlast military power, and that civilization is tested not by how nations fight, but by how they behave when their enemies are helpless. For the Americans, too, there was reflection. Many who once sat behind barbed wire returned home with a deeper understanding of mercy. They had seen the worst of war, but they had also seen how small acts of fairness, a loaf of bread, a shared cigarette, a moment of respect, could preserve humanity in a place designed to erase it. In the ruins of Germany, those small gestures became quiet symbols of what the world would need to rebuild. Dignity, law, and compassion. The war had ended, but its lessons lingered, whispered in the memories of women who watched their nation fall, and in the gratitude of prisoners who walked free. In the end, both sides discovered the same truth: empires crumble, weapons rust, and flags change. But humanity, when preserved even in war, becomes the only true victory that lasts.